For over 200 years, the British ruled India, looting its wealth, exploiting its people, and destroying its industries, education, and economy. But the British didn't just colonize India physically, they colonized minds as well. They rewrote history, manipulated facts, and spread propaganda to justify their rule. They claimed that India was backward, divided, and in need of British governance. These lies are still believed by many today, even in India. But the truth is very different. India was not an uncivilized land that the British built. It was one of the richest nations in the world before British rule. So what were the lies? How did the British justify their empire while systematically draining India's wealth and destroying its self-sufficiency? In this episode, we expose the biggest lies of British colonial rule and reveal the truth they tried to erase. The Civilizing Mission lie. The myth that the British brought progress. The biggest lie used to justify British colonization was the idea that they brought civilization, modernity, and progress to India. The British claimed that before they arrived, India was backward and primitive. Indians had no proper governance, laws, or infrastructure. British rule saved India from chaos and brought progress. But was this true? The reality, India was highly advanced before the British came. Before the British arrived, India was not a land of darkness. It was one of the most advanced civilizations in the world. India's economic dominance. In 1700, India contributed nearly 27% of the world's GDP, making it one of the wealthiest nations globally. Indian industries like textiles, shipbuilding, metallurgy, and agriculture flourished, making it a major player in global trade. Indian merchants used sophisticated banking systems, including hundis, letters of credit, similar to modern banking checks, centuries before European banks developed them. India was a self-sufficient agricultural powerhouse, exporting food grains, spices, and cash crops across Asia and Europe. Ancient Indian engineering and architecture, the evidence that stands today. If India was truly uncivilized before the British, then how do we explain the thousands of years old temples, monuments, and cities that still stand today? These structures, built with advanced engineering techniques, intricate craftsmanship, and mathematical precision, are undeniable proof of India's civilizational progress before British rule. Brihadiswarar Temple, Tamil Nadu, built in 1010 CE, this 1,000-year-old temple has a massive granite dome placed without modern cranes, showcasing India's architectural brilliance. Konark Sun Temple, Odisha, built in the 13th century, built as a chariot for the sun god, its wheels act as sundials, displaying India's advanced knowledge of astronomy and engineering. Kailasa Temple, Ellora, built in the 8th century, a monolithic temple carved out of a single rock, proving the existence of highly skilled artisans and builders centuries before European influence. Rani Ki Vav, Gujarat, built in the 11th century, a massive stepwell with detailed carvings, demonstrating India's expertise in water conservation and underground architecture. Indus Valley Civilization, 30,300 to 1300 BCE. Cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa had underground drainage systems, grid-planned streets, and standardized weights and measures, showing a highly organized urban society. The British did not bring civilization. They arrived in a land that was already highly advanced, destroyed its prosperity, and then took credit for building it. The British built India myth. Who really built India's railways and infrastructure? One of the most repeated claims is that the British built India, particularly its railways, roads, and legal system. But was this done for the benefit of Indians? No. The reality, the British built for themselves, not for India. The railways, roads, and legal system were not built to develop India. They were built for British economic exploitation and military control. The British-built railways are often hailed as a gift to India, but in reality, they were designed to extract wealth, not to improve Indian lives. The railways were built to transport raw materials like cotton, indigo, coal, and tea from India's interior to ports, from where they were shipped to Britain. Rail routes were planned to serve British business interests, not Indian people. They connected British trading hubs to ports, not Indian towns or villages. Indian passengers were treated as second-class citizens, with separate low-quality compartments, while British officials traveled in luxury. Railway construction was funded by excessive taxes imposed on Indians, meaning Indians paid for a system that only benefited the British. Number 2, roads and infrastructure, built for military and trade control. Most roads and bridges built by the British were not for public welfare, but for the easy movement of British troops and goods. Unlike the well-planned roads of ancient India, which connected trade centers and facilitated economic growth, British-era roads were built to reinforce British control and military logistics. British-built ports facilitated the export of Indian raw materials, not the promotion of local industries. The Indian legal system, designed to oppress, not to bring justice. The British introduced laws to strengthen their hold over Indians, not to deliver justice. The Indian Penal Code, IPC, of 1860 was designed to punish Indian resistance while favoring British officials. Judges were mostly British, and laws were written to serve British interests. Indians were often given harsher punishments than British subjects for the same crimes. Police forces were established not for public safety, but to crush uprisings and enforce colonial rule. Another huge British myth is that they modernized India's education system. The truth? They destroyed India's indigenous education system and replaced it with a colonial one. Before British rule, India had one of the world's most widespread education systems, based on gurukuls and community-led schools. The Gurukul system focused on science, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, literature, and philosophy. British policies systematically dismantled these traditional education centers, replacing them with an English medium system designed to produce clerks for British administration. Macaulay's education policy, 1835, openly stated that the goal was to create a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. This colonial education system was not about enlightenment. It was about mental colonization and erasing India's historical knowledge. The British didn't build India, they looted and destroyed it. The British did not bring civilization. They arrived in a land that was already flourishing with advanced architecture, trade, education, and governance. The British did not build India. They built a system to extract resources and wealth while dismantling India's industries, education, and economy. They used Indian labor and Indian taxes to construct railways, roads, and laws that only served British interests. India was one of the richest nations in the world before British rule. By the time they left, it was one of the poorest. The Indians were always divided lie, how the British created caste and religious conflicts. One of the biggest excuses the British used to justify their rule was that Indians were too divided by caste, religion, and region to govern themselves. They claimed that India was a land of warring kingdoms, tribal conflicts, and caste oppression, and that British rule was necessary to bring order and unity. But was this true? Or was this division something the British deliberately deepened to maintain control? The reality: the British deepened divisions that had previously been flexible. Before the British came, India was not a land of constant religious and caste-based strife. While differences existed, they were not as rigid or politically manipulated as they became under British rule. Hindu-Muslim relations. The Mughal Empire, which ruled before the British, had Hindu and Muslim ministers, military commanders, and scholars. Mughal rulers like Akbar promoted religious tolerance, abolishing discriminatory taxes on Hindus and encouraging interfaith dialogues. Many Hindu kings, including the Rajputs, served in Mughal courts, and interfaith alliances were common. The Marathas, a Hindu empire, allied with Muslim rulers against the British and other common enemies. The Maratha military was composed of both Hindus and Muslims, proving that religious identity was not a primary factor in governance before British rule. Sikh rulers, such as Maharaj Ranjit Singh, appointed both Hindu and Muslim governors to run different provinces of his empire. How the British used divide and rule to break India's unity. Once the British took control, they saw Indian unity as a threat. They systematically created new divisions and hardened existing ones. The British conducted caste-based censuses, starting in 1871, which categorized Indians into rigid caste identities that had previously been more fluid. Before this, caste was not always hereditary and could be changed through social mobility, but under British rule, it was made permanent institutionalized. They encouraged communal electorates, introducing separate voting rights for Hindus and Muslims through the Indian Councils Act of 1909, ensuring that Indians would see each other as political rivals instead of allies. They created religious and caste-based political organizations, such as the Muslim League, 1906, to ensure that Hindus and Muslims would negotiate separately with the British rather than unite against colonial rule. They played communities against each other by selectively favoring certain groups over others in administration, the army, and police forces. The partition of Bengal in 1905 was justified as an administrative necessity, but in reality, it was designed to split Hindus and Muslims geographically. Although reversed in 1911, it created deep-rooted communal tensions that later played a role in the partition of India in 1947. The British did not save India from division. They created and weaponized divisions that did not exist before. The British gave India democracy myth. Another major British propaganda claim is that they introduced democracy to India and prepared it for self-rule. British officials argued that India had no democratic traditions and that British rule gradually trained Indians in governance, leading to independence. But was this true? The reality: the British denied Indians basic rights until they were forced to leave. For most of British rule, Indians had little to no political rights and were actively denied participation in their own governance. Indians had no representation in decision-making. The British Crown controlled India directly, with a viceroy in charge, and no Indian was allowed to hold any real power. British laws were passed without Indian consent, and protests were met with violent repression, such as the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in 1919. The Indian National Congress, INC, was originally formed in 1885 not to demand independence, but merely to seek small administrative reforms. Even these requests were denied or ignored by the British government for decades. Laws such as the Rowlatt Act, 1919, allowed the British to arrest and imprison Indians without trial, showing how democracy was never their goal. The British violently suppressed every demand for self-rule, such as the non-cooperation movement, 1920-22, the civil disobedience movement, 1930-34, and the Quit India movement, 1942. In reality, India fought for and won its democracy despite British rule, not because of it. The British left only when they were forced to by mass uprisings, international pressure, and the weakening of Britain after World War II. The India was always poor myth. One of the biggest lies spread by the British is that India was always an underdeveloped and poor nation, and that British rule helped modernize it. The reality: India was one of the richest countries before British rule. India was not always poor. British rule made it poor. In 1700, before British colonization, India contributed over 27% of the global GDP. By 1947, when the British left, this number had fallen to just 3%. India was the world's leading textile producer before the British destroyed the industry. British policies banned Indian textiles and forced India to import machine-made cloth from Britain. Indian weavers were left unemployed, and Bengal, once a major textile hub, saw millions starve due to economic collapse. British land revenue policies forced Indian farmers to grow cash crops, indigo, opium, cotton, for British profit, rather than food crops. This led to mass famines that killed millions. The Bengal famine of 1943, which killed over 3 million people, was not due to food shortages, but because the British exported Indian grain to feed British troops in World War II while Indians starved. The British looted India's wealth, stealing an estimated $45 to $47 trillion in today's value through excessive taxation, economic exploitation, and resource extraction. The Kohinoor diamond, one of the most famous diamonds in the world, was taken from India after the annexation of Punjab in 1849 and remains in the British Crown Jewels. The British looted vast amounts of gold and treasure from Indian temples, palaces, and kingdoms. The loot from Tipu Sultan's treasury alone was worth millions. The Jagannath Temple in Odisha, Padmanabhaswamy Temple in Kerala, and various South Indian temples were raided for their gold. Gold, jewelry, and diamonds from the Maratha, Rajput, and Sikh kingdoms were taken to Britain, enriching the British aristocracy while leaving India impoverished. The British did not bring prosperity to India. They systematically looted its wealth. leading to the widespread poverty that still affects the country today. For over 200 years, the British justified their rule with lies, propaganda, and manipulation. They erased and rewrote Indian history to make it seem as though British rule was a gift to India, when in reality, it was a period of systematic exploitation, destruction, and economic drain. They did not civilize India. India was already flourishing with ancient temples, advanced infrastructure, and thriving industries before British rule. They did not build India. They built a system to extract resources, drain wealth, and strengthen British dominance. They did not unite India. They divided Indians along religious and caste lines to prevent them from rising against colonial rule. They did not introduce democracy. They denied Indians basic rights until they were forced out by mass uprisings. They did not modernize India. They crippled its industries, engineered famines, and left behind a nation struggling with poverty. This is the real history of British rule in India, the history they never wanted the world to know. Coming up next, Part 6, The Forgotten Heroes, Indian Resistance Against British Rule. Subscribe and press the bell icon so you don't miss it.